Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking some fascinating source material that outlines a massive, almost overnight shift in Canadian policy. For decades, Canada has basically been viewed as a defense laggard, leaning heavily on its geography and allies for protection. But according to the analysis we're looking at, they are suddenly transforming into a massive spender. And the wild part? They're betting that billions in military hardware can fundamentally restructure their domestic economy.
To really set the stage here, our source highlights a quote from Prime Minister Mark Carney, who, remember, is a central banker by trade. He described this pivot with just 4 words: a complete game changer. And the text frames this not just as a standard military upgrade, but honestly as the most ambitious industrial gamble Canada has attempted since the National Energy Program. It's literally a massive wager on national sovereignty.
The material actually uses a perfect analogy for this. For nearly 30 years, Canada treated its military the way a homeowner treats a furnace. You totally ignore it until it breaks. Defense spending just sagged around 1% of GDP. And why wouldn't it? Being surrounded by 3 oceans and having a friendly superpower right next door was a heck of a lot cheaper than buying tanks. But then, we jump to the new era outlined in the text, triggered in 2025 by a trade war with Donald Trump's Washington, complete with tariffs and annexation rhetoric. Suddenly, the nation that essentially outsourced its security to the U.S. found its main weapons supplier acting as an antagonist. The result? A shocking vow to hit 5% of GDP in defense spending by 2035, turning defense directly into industrial policy.
Okay, let's dive into this and lay out our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at Canada's defense spending shock. Second, the build, partner, buy strategy. Third, the $150 billion bill. Fourth, rebuilding the arsenal. And finally, we'll wrap up with the ultimate sovereignty wager.
So, Section 1, Canada's defense spending shock. Let's see how this builds from historical complacency straight into sudden strategic panic.
When you map out the timeline from the source, the sheer suddenness of this shock is pretty striking. Back in 2014, spending was just limping along at that 1% mark, which is effectively half of the old NATO requirement. Fast forward to the trade war shock of 2025, that is the major catalyst that just shatters the old geopolitical assumptions. It's what drives the staggering target of hitting 5% of GDP by 2035. At a 2025 NATO summit, allies agreed to this 5%, splitting it up into core military needs, infrastructure, and cybersecurity. So Canada is basically trying to jump from being 27th out of 31 members right up into the Finnish League of Defense Readiness, and they're trying to do it in just a single decade. Moving right along to Section 2, build, partner, buy. We need to understand exactly how Canada actually plans to pull off this unprecedented pivot. How does the money flow? Well, the source breaks down Ottawa's new defense industrial strategy into 3 really crucial pillars. First, build at home wherever Canada can. Second, and this is a huge shift, partner with allies other than America where it must. And third, buy off the shelf only when doing so still feeds local Canadian industry. Notice the massive shift in thinking here. Sovereignty, rather than just getting the best pure value for money, is now the absolute organizing principle for every single dollar spent. And the government's advertised payoffs for this strategy? They are massive. They're promising to create 125,000 jobs by 2035, plus a 50% increase in defense exports. To get around their notoriously slow procurement process, they've gone ahead and created a brand new defense investment agency. Oh, and here's a truly surprising discovery from the text. Canada is signaling a major pivot across the Atlantic by joining the European Union's SAFE program. They are literally buying a seat at a €150 billion joint procurement table. It's a wildly aggressive play to build up a sovereign industrial base.
Which brings us to Section 3, the $150 billion bill. Because look, sovereignty is a fantastic organizing principle in theory, right? But does it actually survive contact with the federal balance sheet?
The sheer, brutal arithmetic here is staggering. To hit that 5% NATO target, it's going to cost Canada roughly 150 billion Canadian dollars a year by 2035. To put that into perspective, back in 2024, NATO counted Canadian defense spending at just 41 billion. The Parliamentary Budget Officer estimates that just getting to the core spending targets alone is going to require an extra 33.5 billion in cash outlays every single year over the next decade.
And as you can probably guess, this triggers immediate fiscal pain. The projected federal deficit is expected to double, hitting roughly 72 billion Canadian dollars in 2025-26. The debt-to-GDP ratio is widening too, so it's no longer on a declining path. think tanks are out there urgently calling for a credible fiscal plan because, frankly, the bills are arriving way faster than the revenue.
This introduces a fascinating macroeconomic trade-off that the source points out, which is the economic multiplier. See, when you spend $1 on domestic defense services, that dollar circulates really well in places like Quebec and Ontario. It keeps the local economy humming. But capital equipment, stuff like imported howitzers and tanks, has one of the lowest multipliers because that money leaks right out of the country, heading over to Texas or Bavaria. And this is exactly why this matters for everyday folks. Every dollar that leaks abroad is a dollar competing directly with domestic healthcare, education, and housing for the exact same limited fiscal oxygen. It's an incredibly delicate political and economic balancing act.
All right, Section 4, Rebuilding the Arsenal. Let's shift gears from abstract billions to tangible realities. We're talking about the actual hardware and the fierce corporate dogfights happening over these contracts.
First up is the fighter jet dogfight. The source presents this amazing comparison. Canada initially committed to the Lockheed Martin F-35, but then immediately launched a massive procurement review. On one side of the ring, you have the F-35, offering a massive 95% operational capability score. But it brings minimal domestic jobs and carries an American red card risk, meaning the U.S. could theoretically block components. On the other side is Sweden's Saab Gripen E. Operationally, it scored much lower in internal leaks, sitting around 33%. However, the emotional and sovereignty logic is entirely in the Gripen's favor. It promises assembly right on Canadian soil, 12,600 domestic jobs, and full sovereign access to the software code. So it's a pure test of operational capability versus industrial sovereignty.
And hey, if the jets reveal a discomfort with America, the submarine battle totally reveals Canada's courtship of everyone else. To replace its aging fleet, Canada is looking at a $60 billion acquisition. The finalists? South Korea's Hanwha Ocean and Germany's TKMS. The economic inducements being thrown around here are wild. Hanwha is dangling 4 boats by 2035 with 22,500 jobs a year and direct investments in Canadian steel. TKMS counters with 4 boats by 2036, 650,000 job years, and a major West Coast sustainment partnership. Some are even floating the idea of splitting the order, deploying German boats in the Atlantic and Korean ones in the Pacific. Sure, that might please diplomats, but as the source notes, it would absolutely horrify logisticians.
Beyond the dogfights, the text highlights where steel is actually being cut today. These aren't just concepts. Real, tangible investments are underway. Canada is building highly capable icebreakers at the Seaspan and Davie shipyards. Through the new trilateral ice pact with the U.S. and Finland, these Canadian yards are now perfectly positioned to export to the U.S. Coast Guard. We're also seeing major investments in basic munitions. For example, General Dynamics is fixing a glaring nitrocellulose supply chain vulnerability with brand new plants in Quebec. Plus, Canada scored a major financial coup, securing the headquarters for the new multilateral Defense Security and Resilience Bank. That alone is bringing hundreds of finance jobs to Montreal or Toronto.
Finally, Section 5, the ultimate sovereignty wager. Let's pull all of this together to see the winners, the losers, and the ultimate macroeconomic bet. Quickly summarizing the beneficiaries outlined in the source, shipbuilders like Davie and Seaspan are clear winners. Sweden's Saab is definitely breaking through as the standout foreign winner. General Dynamics wins big in munitions. And for our finance-minded viewers out there, the text actually highlights specific Toronto Stock Exchange tickers that are heavily exposed to this boom. We're talking about companies like CAE for simulation, Bombardier for special mission aircraft, MDA Space, Magellan Aerospace, and Hero Devectech. Though just a quick reminder, this explainer is purely looking at the source analysis, definitely not providing personal investment advice.
On the flip side of this massive shift, the text identifies some pretty stark casualties. Lockheed Martin and other U.S. primes are losing their guaranteed ground. The U.S.-Canada defense relationship itself is a strategic casualty experiencing some very real friction right now. Economically speaking, the federal balance sheet and competing social programs are taking a massive hit as the deficit balloons. And finally, the Canadian taxpayer stands to lose big time if this new strategy falls back into the country's historic, terrible habit of severe procurement delays and cost overruns.
Which brings us to the central thesis of the text, the grand wager. When you strip away all the press releases and political spin, Canada is betting the house on one big idea. They're betting that a generational surge in military spending can successfully double as an industrial policy. They are actively trying to rebuild their domestic economy, shipyards, munitions lines, aerospace, while simultaneously buying sovereignty and independence from a suddenly unreliable southern neighbor.
So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought drawn straight from our material. Remember that metaphor of the homeowner ignoring the broken furnace until winter hits?
Well, with a widening deficit, fierce corporate battles, and historically slow procurement processes, the big question is, can Canada actually build these ships, jets, and munitions before a geopolitical crisis hits? Will the furnace get fixed before the next cold snap? The bills are coming due by the end of the decade, and soon enough, so will the verdict. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, everyone. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.